Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. Legendary author Joyce Carol Oates' latest Babysitter is an engrossing thriller with a bit of true crime set against a backdrop of child murderers in the affluent suburbs of 1970s Detroit. Oates rooted the novel in the real unsolved case of the Babysitter Killer who struck in Oakland County, Michigan, and the story unfolds from the vantage point of Hannah, an unpredictable stay-at-home mom, as she brushes dangerously close to the killer. Babysitter is a starkly narrated exploration of the riskiness of pursuing alternate lives, calling into question how far we are willing to go to protect those whom we cherish the most. The novel is an indictment of corrupt politics, unexamined racism, and the enabling of sexual predation in America. Joyce Carol Oates has written some of the most enduring fiction of our time, including the national bestsellers We Were the Mulvaneys, Blonde, and The Falls. She is the Roger Berlin Distinguished Professor of the Humanities Emerita at Princeton University and has been a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters since 1978. It is a great pleasure to welcome Joyce Carol Oates back to the Book Show. Joyce, thank you very much for being with us. What a delight to have you back on our program.
Thank you for inviting me.
Give us a sense of what brought you to this real crime in the 1970s in Oakland County, Michigan, and when you found out about it and how long you've been thinking that it could be something you'd want to write a novel about.
Well, I have to say I'm just haunted by Detroit. When I lived there, I was a young married woman, a young instructor at the University of Detroit. Detroit itself was a sort of a different city in those days. It was booming. It was, Motor City, USA. And then after the civil disturbance of July 1967, it became a different city. Into the 70s, I think also continued to become a different city. So the babysitter, or the Oakland County child killer, he was variously called, he began abducting and murdering children sometime, I think, in 1977. It may have been 1976, but at that time I was quite friendly with women, mostly women and their husbands too, but I met these women for lunch often in Birmingham and Bloomfield Hills, and they lived in those suburbs. So I got to know them very well and really became haunted by the subject matter. I started writing a novel probably in 1978 or so, around the time that I moved to Princeton, New Jersey, about this situation, about there being a serial killer of children in a community, and nobody knows who it is. And the novel was from the point of view possibly of someone who is going to be a victim. I mean, I worked on it for a while. I had about 100 pages. So I set that aside. I wasn't so happy with the way it was turning out. And also, we didn't know much about Babysitter then. So years and years and years went by. I mean, many decades actually went by. I wrote a short story called Babysitter, which was published in Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine. And that short story is mostly the first chapter of the novel. So then maybe 10 years later, I wrote the novel Babysitter. So as you can see, there was a long gestation. But I have to say, I'm just haunted by Detroit. I go into a kind of trance, hypnosis. I remember driving on, the different throughways, the expressways in Detroit, and Livernois Avenue and 8 Mile Road and Woodward and Gratiot and all these street names which are just hypnotic to me. Because as I said, I was a young married woman at that time. It was sort of like the beginning of my adult life.
The actual killer who abducted and murdered, I think, 2 boys and 2 girls in and around Detroit was known for leaving the bodies of the children on display in public places. This would come a few weeks after they disappeared. And several suspects, including the son of a prominent family who later committed suicide, were identified. But the case was really never solved. Did that add to it, the fact that it was in many ways a cold case, that you didn't have the ending as far as even in your own mind as to what happened?
Well, yes, I would not have written about it otherwise. I'm not really writing about true crime cases. I'm more writing about the phenomenon of sexual predation in America, but particularly the enabling, the whole network of sort of a pedophile ring. I didn't know this in the 1970s, of course. A lot has been brought to light since then. I mean, I had no idea. There was no Google in those days.
Right.
There was probably very little information about this killer at the time when I was first trying to write about it. I was trying to write about it from the point of view of people who are living there. So this time I have the advantage of time and history. I can read about it, and definitely I would not write about it if the mystery was solved. I also wrote a novel called My Sister, My Love. It was based on the John Benet Ramsey case, another American exploitation of a child. That murder case was never solved either. So I've written a number of fictional, sort of speculative works about cases in America that were never solved. There were a few others also.
Hannah Jarrett is the protagonist of this novel, and is a wealthy woman, a suburban housewife. Much like you were saying, seems to also be, for one reason or another, haunted by the city of Detroit. There is a loneliness and a boredom that is set in for Hannah.
Yes, she's one of these people. Of course, there are many of us, I guess I'm in that category too, who find themselves really very lonely. They could be actually married or they could be widows, but she's in a family and she does have a husband, but she understands that he no longer really cares about her. She's sort of a function in his life. And she has two children she loves, but they don't really know her. They only know Mommy. They're very dependent on their mother, but they don't know her. And she sort of looks at her own mother, who endured a loveless marriage, and her husband was very cruel to her. And so she's just feeling very, very mortal, very lonely, very vulnerable, not to be loved, not to feel really that you can trust your husband. She has an idea that he's probably unfaithful to her. So she's very vulnerable, and a man who flatters her, who makes her think she's special, all that I thought is just very irresistible to write about. People fall under the spell of awful people. They could be cult leaders. Right. They get become hypnotized by them somehow. These charismatic people give weaker people a sense of identity and meaningfulness in their lives, or they tell them they love them or they're beautiful. And even though you might sort of think that it isn't true, you sort of want to believe it. So she's in that category.
Joyce Carol Oates is our guest on this week's book show. The name of the new novel is Babysitter. It is published by Knopf. What is fascinating is that there's such that feeling of loneliness, and the attraction she has continues even after she is the victim of being battered by this man, and yet goes to see him again. It is something that really causes huge ripples in her life, with her marriage, obviously within the community, and yet she does not stay away from the man that you refer to as YK.
Right. Well, people are drawn to people like that, and I liken it a little bit to a cult leader. The cult leader can actually be a person who's objectively awful. Like we look upon him and think, well, why would anybody be drawn to this person? And yet there's some sort of sinister, I call it a dark charisma. And we see it in political leaders. I mean, certainly some of the demagogues of the 20th century, like Hitler, they exuded that dark charisma, even though we look at him, the newsreels of him, and we think he's a malevolent clown. He's sort of terrifying, but comical. Nonetheless, people fall under the spell of these dark, charismatic figures, and they will do things very contrary to common sense and to their own well-being. They sometimes give them all their money. They run away and live with them. Charles Manson was a bit like that, too. It isn't even really that Hannah actually totally believes that he loves her. She just wants to believe it. And then she feels that she needs a protection against her vulnerability in her marriage. So some people in marriages, if they think that their spouse doesn't love them, they will have an affair, not out of love, but because they need this protection, like they need an armor. And they can think, well, I have a lover, so I don't need you. It's somewhat childish or perhaps childlike. But I'm very sympathetic to people in these positions, and I think many women who don't have careers and whose children are either too young to really appreciate them or who moved out and have, left home, I think women are particularly vulnerable.
One of the things I found fascinating is how you bring race into this story, because it is Hannah's husband who finds out that she has been attacked and ultimately moves forward with little or no evidence to blame a black parking attendant. Was that something that you really wanted to focus on in the story of how easily that happens, of how a person of color can be blamed for something that they had absolutely nothing to do with?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, well, we see it all the time. On Twitter, I follow accounts that are sort of monitoring police brutality and misconduct around the country, and it's constant. It's like, every day. Black youth are shot in the back. I mean, we read about it all the time, but we don't read about all of it. Actually, there are homeless people who are targeted, too. Law enforcement in the country is just, in some parts of the country, they're like rogues. They're like doing lynching, but they have a badge and they have identification, so they get away with it. So we know now, subsequently to the so-called Detroit riot, we know how the police officers were harassing and brutalizing the black population, particularly young black men, in Detroit in those days. But at the time in 1967, when it all erupted, I don't think most white people had a clue. We didn't know. These awful things started happening, but sort of out of nowhere because there's this ignorance. Now, subsequently, we do know a lot about race in Detroit and all around the country. In cities like Newark and Camden and Los Angeles that also had riots. But books have been written on the subject now. But, when you live through an event like that, you don't actually know what's going on. It's sort of chaotic. So people are always blaming race. So Wes in the novel, the first thing he thinks, it's got to be a black man. They're all after us. He's seen Detroit sort of turn black. He's seen, like, people like himself left Detroit to live in the suburbs. And this is the mindset for much of America actually right now.
It certainly, Wes is, as you say, identifies I can't even say accused, but identifies the man who may have attacked his wife as black. Hannah feels remorseful and regret over that, almost even more so than over some of the other things that she herself is doing, like having this affair with this man who's assaulting her.
Yes, well, she gets put in that position because she doesn't want to tell her husband that she's having this affair, and she doesn't. She's so ashamed, and she's so broken, and really, she's sort of like a battered woman. She's just not able to control things. Her husband starts saying, well, who did this to you? So she sort of makes up a crazy story that she fell down some steps. Now, that wasn't true, but later on in the novel, she starts sort of remembering that she fell down some steps. That's actually the way people are. They make something up if they're traumatized or stunned, and then they start remembering that as if it were true. She has to make herself remember, well, this actually never happened. That black parking attendant, totally innocent, didn't have anything to do at all. Nothing, literally nothing to do with anything in her life, but he's being blamed by the husband. And the husband tells this story to the white police detectives, and they're kind of listening to it, and they don't exactly believe it, but then they pass it on to police officers in Detroit, because they're in the suburbs, who go to pick up this man. They end up killing him because he's running away. So it's like one thing, a white person does this and another white person does that, and two other white people do that, and then some white police officers wind up, they think they've got a warrant, or maybe they do have a warrant, and they think they don't know who this person is. They think he could be a drug dealer. They think he's going for his gun. And they're sort of at the end of a whole food chain, so they actually kill him. And then later on there's an investigation, and it's decided that these were justified, was a justified shooting. So all this just happens all the time. I mean, the trajectory of that. So I was just putting in a novel.
Joyce Carol Oates is our guest. The name of the new novel is Babysitter. There is such really self-loathing with Heather, and you remind us of that several times, how little she feels about herself and the shame, really. What brought you to that, and then to connect the dot to that of such extreme violence?
Well, Hannah is sort of a protagonist who might be a figure in a film, let's say by Antonioni, where she's almost like a sleepwalker. She remembers a good deal about her own parents and her father, who seemed to taunt her. He seemed to make her think that she was his favorite child, and maybe he loved her in a way, but maybe he didn't love her. She's still trying to get the love of her father. I also wrote a novel about Marilyn Monroe,
right.
Norma Jean Baker, and she too had this fixation with a father who never acknowledged her. Father never identified himself, even after Marilyn Monroe was a famous name. He wouldn't acknowledge her as his daughter for some reason I don't quite understand, but she probably was totally maimed through her life. It's a little bit like that. She's searching for identity and meaning in men and in other people. It would have been so much better for her to have had a career and to have sort of her self-worth in herself, rather than the husband's like the repository of her self-worth is in him. And if she doesn't have a husband, that would be a disaster. For a suburban woman, especially in the 1970s, in that society, to lose your husband was just to lose everything. You lose your social status, you lose the house, your lifestyle, as they called it. Many of those marriages didn't end in divorce, and the husband would just move on and marry a younger woman, some cases who resembled the divorced wife.
You mentioned the book, Your Portrait of Marilyn Monroe, entitled Blonde. That's actually been adapted for a Netflix film. I'm interested in the idea of choices that we have and those moments, those pivotal moments in our life of where we have decisions, and do we go right or do we go left? And thinking of those as what is right and what is wrong, and what is considered to be normal and what is considered to be reckless. And you do seem to focus on that quite a bit in your work.
Well, I do, and I often write in the historic present. The novel is narrated in the historic present. Like, it's like a movie in the sense that you're in the movie. Like, your life is like a movie. You don't exactly know what the script is, and you don't know how it's going to turn out. And I'm interested in these moments or hours leading up to some irrevocable act, thinking back to the minutes leading up to, say an accident. I'm sure people have those nightmares all the time. You find that you're awake at 4 a.m. and you're reliving that half hour as you're moving toward that awful thing that could have been prevented if you had only known it was coming. But we never know that it's coming. So I think that the exciting moments in our lives are these unresolved movements, like we're in motion. Now, there's a different kind of consciousness which is retrospective, and that's at rest and meditative. So you're thinking back to something that happened in 1977. It's all over with. It's a story that's completed, and you can talk about it. But when you're actually in it, it's, your heart is quickening and your pulse is fast, and you have no idea what's going to happen. I like to dramatize those times in our lives which are they're thrilling but also somewhat terrifying.
Much of your work does feature these bouts of violence, whether it be a rape or a car crash or abuse. Do you know what brings you to that, of why you're interested in that?
Well, I do write novels that don't necessarily have that kind of events in them. Like my novel before this is called Breathe, and that was actually very different. But living in America and growing up in America through the 20th century, it's America. America is very violent. Detroit is still a violent city. It's somewhat depopulated compared to what it was some years ago. Stendhal's novel is a mirror held up to the highway, a mirror. So people look in the mirror and they see what's moving along the highway. It's a nice metaphor. And of course, there's a frame around the mirror that the author or the filmmaker provides the frame that shows the mirror, and then there is, I guess, the interpretation of I'm not writing in a vacuum, Jane Austen was writing, she was writing at a time of great, slave trade, and much was going on. There were wars, but Jane Austen really only wrote about, like, the drawing room. She really only wrote about a kind of female, feminine society, but I don't do that, and women writers today don't generally do that. We write about anything.
Given that your body of work is so impressive and it is so wide and varied, and as you say, you've written about so many different topics and so many different things, but it does seem, and I think you've said this to me in the past, of how you are drawn to stories about crime.
Well, I'm drawn to stories that are dramatic, but I actually lived through the so-called Detroit Riot, so naturally I would want to write about something that was so central to my own young life.
Do you return to Detroit regularly?
No, I don't know anyone there anymore. I did used to go back once in a while, but I don't remember the last time I went back. I visited the Grosse Pointe Library. I gave a reading there, but I'm also not invited back. I don't think I've ever had an invitation from Wayne State. Once in my whole life, not once, never. I mean, writers do go where they're invited, but I don't think I haven't been invited.
Do you think that's because of what you write about either the city, about the state, or because it would be hard to believe that they would be, for want of a better term, punishing you for writing about something that happened while you were there that was very real?
Oh, no, I think it's just complete indifference or just not aware.
Yeah.
No, I don't think No, my name would probably just never come up. It's nothing like a blacklist. No, not at all. But I haven't been invited to Ann Arbor. I mean, I've been in Kalamazoo. I've been in different places. But I do remember going most recently to a very nice library in Grosse Pointe and giving a reading there. I just mentioned Wayne State,
Right.
there in Detroit. I mean, who knows? Who knows how few poets and writers they invite at all? Or perhaps they would be much more interested in someone younger or more like an ethnic minority. I don't think I would be of any interest.
And yet you're still haunted by the city.
Oh, the city, yeah, the city. Just the way the streets are and driving around. Oh, yeah, I can shut my eyes and sort of drive all around, going up and down Woodward, especially out into Birmingham, Bloomfield Hills.
When you hear a siren, how do you react to that?
Well, I've subsequently lived in New York City where there's sirens all the time.
Right.
So in New York, there are always sirens, so you don't even hear them.
But does it fascinate you and make you wonder?
No, I don't. No. People are very, very impervious to sirens in New York.
I'm just interested in that idea of the haunting of going back once again to Detroit and writing this novel.
I think I wrote a prose poem that was just made up of street names of Detroit. I just thought they were just so wonderful. I mean, the whole long, like an incantation of all these names.
Joyce Carol Oates' new novel is Babysitter. It is published by Knopf. Joyce Carol Oates, I can't tell you what a honor and pleasure it is to speak with you. I so enjoy when you're on our program, and this work is just phenomenal, and I thank you for sharing with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Again, the name of the new novel is Babysitter by Joyce Carol Oates. We enjoy hearing from our listeners about our shows. You can email us at book@wamc.org. You can listen again to this or find past book shows via podcast or at wamc.org. Sarah LeDuc produces our program. Bookmark us for next week. And thanks for listening.